Hello and welcome to Jesus College. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. I'm Asher and this is Amy. We're the co-founders of Jesus College, Modern Languages and Linguistics Society. And we're very excited to have joining us today Rory Cellan-Jones. Rory studied modern medieval languages at Jesus College before going on to work in journalism, most notably as the technology correspondent for the BBC. After a successful career reporting on some of the most important moments in tech history, from the release of the iPhone to interviewing Elon Musk on the future of self-driving cars, he retired in 2021. He has since been running a podcast called Movers and Shakers, alongside some other famous faces such as Jeremy Paxman, as well as releasing his new book last year called Ruskin Park, Sylvia, Me and the BBC, and keeping up to date with technology and his internet-famous dog Sophie through social media. So can we please have a warm welcome and a round of applause for Rory.
Thank you, thank you.
Just a bit about the structure of the interview. We're going to do three main parts. I'll speak about, well, I won't speak, you will, about your life at Jesus. Then I'll defer to Amy, a bit about your career in the BBC, some of your more recent endeavours, and then we'll open it up to questions from the crowd and from the live stream. So I thought to start off, it may have surprised people that after a lifetime of reporting on technology, your roots are actually in humanities, in languages. So I wonder what drew you to MML and what was the course like in your time?
Well, thank you for coming, everybody. This is an extraordinary honour. I thought I was coming for a little sort of, chinwag with a few language students on their way to the bar. And look at this is brilliant. I was brought up in South London and went to a school called Dulwich College. And I was brought up by my mum in a one-bedroom council flat in South London without my father. And she was very ambitious for me, had very few resources, but I managed to get a scholarship to Dulwich College, an assisted place, which was a school that sent vast numbers of pupils to Oxbridge. And I got into languages quite early. It was a thing I was really good at. I had one of my first solo foreign trip when I was 17 to France to stay with a French family. And I loved languages. And Dulwich was a bit of an exam machine and basically said, right, you're going to Jesus. That's the one we picked for you. I didn't get any choice. I don't think I even got a choice of whether it was Oxford or Cambridge. But they just parcelled me out and said, that's where you'll go if you get in. So I did. And I did what was called seventh term in those days. So I did it in the autumn after my A-levels. And then I went for 6 months in the most extraordinary trip that sort of shaped a lot of my life, really. To spend 6 months in West Berlin with a group called Meet Berlin, and it was at the height of the Cold War, and we were young people about to study German at university, and we were all given jobs and accommodation, and had a hell of a time. Okay. We arrived in the snow in February, and were put up in a conference centre, looked out of the window, and there was a wall around the conference centre, and then we thought, that's the wall. And we lived in the shadow of that for 6 months. So I arrived here really into the idea of studying languages.
What languages did you study, by the way?
French and German.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, Cambridge University academics are a fairly important part of life here. But it's not all that. There are some hobbies, societies. How do you remember your social involvement in the college during your time here?
Well, I arrived in October 1977, and here's the terrible truth. I wasn't that keen on my college at first because it was not mixed. It was at Cambridge overall. There were 4 boys for every girl, and so one didn't really want to socialise in college. It was very boaty. I know. I'm sorry. I know you're a bit of a boaty person, which I was not particularly into. So I spent a lot of time out of college. I ran briefly to be JCR president, came last, so I said, stuff that, and moved on to other things. But it was... I really began to love the college when I returned from my year abroad in Paris and discovered that in my absence, it had become mixed, and the whole atmosphere of the place had changed, and it was a very friendly, very nice place. I must just briefly talk about my supervisors, who were actually a great bunch. There was a man called Cameron Wilson, who was the most gentle and kindly and shy man, who was French. And there was an elderly chap called Trevor Jones, who had been compiling the great German-English dictionary for many years and had got to S. And there was some doubt as to whether he'd ever make it to Z. And we used to basically sit there where he reminisced about having been in Germany in the 30s and met Himmler. And would you like a dry sherry? And we'd drink a dry sherry, and we'd finish after about an hour and think, well, I'm not sure I learned much there, but that was quite fun. And then we had quite late on, we had a breath of fresh air, really, and we had a new young German supervisor who we'd turn up in his room for supervision, and he'd be sitting back there having a fag, and he'd have the racing on, and he'd say, "I'm really sorry, but do you mind? I've got a tenner on the 3:30 at Lingfield." And we'd watch the race, and then he'd give us the most tremendous grilling and tear apart our essays on Kafka. And he was a tremendous influence. And he's called Michael Minden. And I have a slight suspicion he might be here tonight somewhere.
You've spoken a bit about your travel, and obviously travel is an integral part of the MML degree here, both to fine-tune your language skills and for that cultural exchange. I was wondering if we could ask you a bit more about your year abroad in Paris, how that shaped you, how that changed your mindset coming back in the fourth year.
Well, what was remarkable in the late 70s was that it wasn't compulsory to do a year abroad. I thought you'd be mad not to want to do that.
Yeah.
And actually, about half the people that I knew doing languages didn't do it and left. Had left by the time I returned. I went to be an assistant at the Lycée de Saint-Cloud in Paris, which was great for my social life, probably not as brilliant for my French as being in some remote village, because I did speak a lot of French, but I spoke a lot of English, and there were lots of American friends. I actually went around America in the summer afterwards, staying with lots of the people I'd met in Paris. I lived in a chambre de bonne on the 6th floor, up 6 flights of steps, which eventually ended my smoking habit, because you couldn't walk up 6 flights of steps after a packet of Gauloises and feel good about yourself. One thing I did there was I went to Jean-Paul Sartre's funeral. Jean-Paul Sartre died while I was in Paris. And I think Roland Barthes was also run over on my street. I can't remember. I don't know what it was about me, but I was the angel of death. But everybody took to the streets for Sartre's funeral, which was a complete bun fight. I got a very distant picture on my Kodak Instamatic from a long way away, and kept the newspapers for many years, I remember. But what was different when I came back, apart from the college being mixed, was that I gained a new confidence, because I arrived thinking I'd quite like to do student journalism. But everybody will be incredibly clever, and it'll be too intimidating. And I got back and I thought, maybe I'll give it a go. And I found out what you always find out, that it's not necessarily, there were some clever people, but the defining characteristic, certainly of journalism, is people with sharp elbows and determination to knock down the doors and say, me, me, me. So I said, me, and became eventually the features editor of Stock Press, which was what Varsity was called for a brief time there. My first splash.
Wow.
a report on. I was talking to these young people before. I don't think they knew who the Specials were.
No.
I said to them, Ghost Town. People remember the Specials, don't they? Tell these people how great they were. Anyway, there was a bit of a riot at a gig they had, and I covered the court case, and my first court case, and used this sort of thing as not a passport into a job in journalism, because it was still bloody hard. There were lots of schemes in those days to get into journalism, and I applied for everyone you can possibly imagine, and eventually got one.
So you dabbled in student journalism, and I wonder, in your later career...
Dabbled, I flung myself into it.
Do you think the skills you learned from languages aided you in your journalistic career?
Well, here's the thing. I talked about people who didn't go abroad and went straight into careers after 3 years here. And one of my great friends... like so many others, everyone became a bloody chartered accountant. I came back and everyone who had been a carefree student had become a chartered accountant. And I said to this great friend of mine, who is a friend, to be fair, 40 years later, you are going to be a boring old chartered accountant, not using your languages, and I'm going to be a journalist bestriding the world using my languages. And he promptly spent 10 years in Hong Kong and then 20 years in Eastern Europe, privatizing Eastern Europe, as using his languages a lot. And I started my reporting career in Leeds, then came to London, then eventually came to Cardiff to become an actual reporter. And didn't use my languages much, but there was one particular occasion, and you have to keep the languages going, don't you, to be practicing them. Before I became a reporter, I was quite successful for 3 or 4 years, rising up the ladder as a producer at a time of great expansion of the BBC. And I was in this special unit doing sort of big foreign... Well, I did my very first big foreign story, which was the trial of the man who had forged Hitler's diaries. It was a big scandal. This guy's forger had convinced this journalist from Stern magazine that he had found Hitler's diaries, and I think the journalist was in on the con as well, actually, to be truthful. And we were preparing for the trial. I was working with John Simpson, who still works for the BBC, great man, great reporter, and I found out, to be honest, somebody else, I think on Newsnight had already done this, but I found out that you could go and interview the forger in his prison cell. The German authorities allowed this in the run-up to the trial. And I arranged to go over, and with John Simpson. And then the day before we were due to go, John Simpson was dispatched to a hijacking in Cyprus. So I was sent solo with our 3-man crew. And John had said to me, book us into the Four Seasons in Hamburg, dear boy. It's such a nice hotel. And I turned up on my first foreign trip and arrived at this hotel, which was indeed splendid. It was the sort of place where you came out of the lift, which are operated by a lift operator in a uniform, and somebody else opened the door of the lift and escorted you from the lift to your breakfast table. And then in the evening, the crew, and it was 3 people in those days, it very quickly became 1 person, all decided that they liked gin and tonics. And of course, I would have to pay for them. And I sat there terrified, thinking, how the hell am I going to get that through? But then the next day, we went to do the interview in the prison cell, and I'd written down some of my questions. My German was still okay, but I found, when I was searching through this notebook the other day, some of the questions, and the key one, after about 3 or 4 sort of vaguely exploratory ones, is "Wo ist das Geld?" Where is the money? Anyway, this forger was an extremely jolly chap, very amiable. I had to interview him in German, and we got on fine. And he had this party trick of forging anything you liked. So the crew all got Himmler's signature and Goering's signature. But I got the big prize because as part of the filming, he forged a page from Hitler's diaries.
Wow.
1st of September 1939, and there it is in my BBC notebook. And in fine sort of Gothic script. And as we were filming, right at the end, he signed and said, "Adolf Hitler, da, finished," and put the pen down. And it was a great shot. It was the closing shot of John Simpson's piece, which went out weeks later. So that was one of the few occasions when I really used my languages.
Should we discuss your BBC career?
So obviously let's talk a bit more about your career in the BBC now. So I think the main question is, coming from a languages background, why did you choose to specialise in technology?
Well, I didn't at first. I mean, just to give you a picture of how undigital I was and how undigital life was here. So in the late 70s, there was I think a computer in an office at the bottom of K staircase. There had been one computer in my school, Dulwich College, which was in the science block, and it could only be attended by boys in white coats doing physics who fed it ticker tape. And I certainly wasn't doing physics. I knew nothing about that. And of course, it was before even the internet, let alone the World Wide Web. And my mother didn't even have a phone. She was very eccentric, and we didn't have a phone at home, so I had to write letters home each week. And I was thinking about how we as students communicated. We had this brilliant method. We had a piece of paper on our doors, and people would come and write on it, meet you in the bar at whatever. It's what we call texting. But it somehow worked. So I had no technical background at all. But I eventually became a business correspondent, and in the mid-90s, I was already getting a bit bored. I'd only just been made a full correspondent, which is a sort of big step up in the BBC. But after about the third time you've done Marks and Spencer's first quarter results, you think, is this all there is to it? And I had a trip to New York to sit in for the New York correspondent. While I was there, two things happened. I got sent to interview Bill Gates, who just brought out one of his sort of semi-autobiography. And he was not a very exciting man to interview, but he did give me a copy of his book, inscribed to Rory, "Good luck with computers, Bill," which is slightly strange. I'd been left some money after the death of a relative, and we as a family had got our first computer, and it was an Apple Mac. This is 1996. And I found out about this thing called the internet, and I bought a modem for it. I spent all the money I'd been left on this, £2,000, when you think about it, on an Apple Performer 630 with a 250 megabyte hard drive. And when you turned it on, an animation happened, a cartoon happened. My wife and I and our 5-year-old son sat round this thing going, "That's amazing." It's easy to forget how magical technology can appear. And then I hooked it up to the internet and went to the Louvre's website, which was one of the first sort of well-developed websites. And we watched as, I forget what painting it was, I think it was a Van Gogh Sunflowers or something like that, animated onto the screen, line by line by line. And again, absolutely magical. And then I went to New York, on this trip to New York, and while I was there, Netscape had floated the first sort of web browser, and it was the first .com stock. And this company, which was one of these classic, probably very little revenue companies, suddenly its stock price soared, and there was a huge amount of hoopla around it. And I began to get very interested in, as a business story, but also as a sort of cultural story, the rise of the dot-coms. I mean, Google was born in, I think, 98, and it was just a fascinating time. So gradually the BBC let me do more and more of this. And in 2000, the year 2000, when there was this enormous dot-com boom, they suddenly said to me, we're going to make you internet correspondent. It was March 2000. And my wife, who's a very distinguished economist and a professor here in Cambridge, said rather cynically, that sounds like a sell signal to me. And she was absolutely right. It was the day the NASDAQ peaked, and 3 months later, the bubble had burst, and the BBC said, I think the internet's over. Can you go back to being a business correspondent? But I got the bug by then, and I kept on doing technology stories as a business correspondent. And then eventually in 2007, they said, oh, the internet's back. We're going to call you technology correspondent. Is that all right? And I, of course, leapt at the chance, and it was the best. It was brilliant timing, and it was the best job one could possibly have for 14, 15 years.
And when covering these stories, obviously not coming from a STEM technology background, did you ever run into any challenges,
all
coming
the
from a different background?
All the time. The most difficult story I've ever covered is trying to explain quantum computing in 2.5 minutes on the BBC. I used to. There was a very helpful PR guy at Microsoft who set all this stuff up. They were getting into it in a big way, and we went over to see a lab in Denmark. First of all, we did a little piece in in a sort of virtual studio where I explained the difference between a bit and a qubit. And then we went to see this lab in Copenhagen, and they'd flown people in from Seattle and wherever. And we put this piece together, and it went out on the news, and it was fine. But at the end of the week, it was on Gogglebox. Does anybody watch Gogglebox? Yeah. Anyway, there is a particular Asian family on that who are really into their technology, I think, and they were looking at this, and they said, "Oh, it's Rory again with his tech stuff." And then there was a moment of silence, and then one of them said, "What the fuck?" And the PR man from Microsoft rang me up. I could hear his head in his hands saying, "How am I going to explain that to Seattle, to Redmond?" So another very nice man who I used to talk to a lot about things like quantum computing, because he understood it and I didn't. He coined something called the Cellan-Jones paradox, which he said the paradox was you can explain quantum computing in a way that is accurate or comprehensible, but never both at the same time. And when I left the BBC, my producer got this printed on a mug for me.
So you've obviously covered a lot of interesting tech, and you must have spoken to a lot of interesting people to kind of cover these stories. So do you have the most memorable interview that you've ever done that you could tell us about?
Yeah, let's talk first about most memorable event. I mean, I was extremely lucky in my timing, because I was made officially technology correspondent in 2007, and the first thing the BBC did was send me to this huge tech event, which I began to dread in subsequent years, in Las Vegas, called CES, where all the big companies unveil things and you can see the trends. And I said, sort of chancing my arm, this is great, and I know we're spending a lot of money, but I think we need to take one day out and go to San Francisco to an event called Macworld, where Steve Jobs, who's always been very picky about rubbing shoulders with other tech companies, has got his own gig, and there's rumours that there's going to be something big. And the BBC kind of said, in for a penny, in for a pound. And I flew over from Las Vegas to San Francisco for this event, and what was it? It was the launch of the unveiling of the iPhone, which was an extraordinary event, which I was at first it was the first time I'd seen the mass hysteria that began to accompany sort of tech launches. And as a British journalist, I always found it I'd always found it a bit distasteful, all that kind of hoopla, these sort of fanboys. But it was an amazing performance by Steve Jobs. He kind of walks onto the stage, and it's up there on YouTube. It's worth watching. And he's in this black polo neck and the jeans and the wireframe glasses, and he sort of stands there like a preacher and has a moment's silence and looks down, and then he looks up and says, "We're going to make some history here today." And I go, "Oh, God." And everybody else goes, "Whoa!" And then he does this great sort of rhythmic, I don't know, hellfire preacher almost, performance whereby he says, "We're going to launch not one, but 3 groundbreaking products today. A touchscreen music player, an internet device, and a phone. A touchscreen music player, an internet device, and a phone." And he keeps repeating this, and then people get more and more hysterical. And then, of course, you begin to realize it's all one device, and it's called the iPhone. Cue complete hysteria. And I knew that. So my office back in London, they knew technology was important, but they were actually a bit bored by it normally. But I knew this was going to be big, because as I left the hall, and don't forget, it's 8 hours behind, so I left the hall about 11 o'clock in the morning, which is 7 p.m. London time, having to get this story onto the 10 o'clock news. And I got a call from the news desk where they said, "You've got to have that phone in your hand. We've seen the pictures, it's amazing." And I said, "You are having a laugh." Because Apple is a nightmare company to deal with. It's always been a nightmare to deal with, incredibly controlling. The phone doesn't come out for 6 months. I'm not going to get near it. And then I realized that I'd been promised the day before an interview, not with Steve Jobs, but with his slightly uncharismatic marketing guy, Phil Schiller. And I'd said, "Yeah, we'll do that," thinking, no, we won't. I changed my mind, rushed back to the conference center, said, "Mr. Schiller, we'd like to interview you, but do you happen to have the phone?" "Oh, yeah." So I got to hold the phone, do the piece to camera, and race back to the hotel, drop the interview that we did with Phil Schiller, because we still weren't interested in him, but he served his purpose. Feed, it was one of the early times that we'd fed a breaking story across the internet, because the pattern used to be to hire a satellite truck or go to the local TV station, and hiring a satellite truck cost $2,000 for a quarter of an hour. And then we began to discover you could feed video over the internet, but it was incredibly slow. But luckily there was a hotel with a very fast internet connection. We got there, got it on time, we got on the news. It was great. And at the weekend, the Observer's technology columnist wrote about this event. He's here tonight. And he described me holding this phone like a French medieval peasant holding a piece of the one true cross. I don't think he quite realised what had gone into the effort to get hold of the phone.
That's really interesting. So obviously you were there for, the unveiling of the first iPhone, and now we're at iPhone 15. So you've obviously seen technology develop over your career, but is it fair to say that you've also seen journalism and the news develop as well? Because now, there's an abundance of information online, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of people feel quite overwhelmed when thinking about reading the news. So it sounds like a bit of a silly question, but how do you read the news?
Well, I mean, just spooling back, to say that it's changed is, an understatement. So when I arrived in my first job, which was a researcher on Look North in Leeds, local news programme, they were still on film. They were still shooting on film. So you'd go out with a camera crew, and then when you got back, have to wait 45 minutes while the film was processed. There were no computers at all in the newsroom. It was a clatter of typewriters. There was sort of clouds of smoke. Everyone smoked. There was a pub across the road, but luckily there was also a bar in the building, and the programme editor used to go down for a pint half an hour before the programme and take a second one into the gallery for the programme. So that was the sort of atmosphere. Graphics in that stage were done with Letraset and bits of cardboard, and if you wanted to animate, literally, it seems extraordinary now, animating a graphic involved pulling out a piece of cardboard to reveal what was beneath. The very first computer graphics were just happening then. And obviously, the media was in a very different shape. The newspapers were incredibly powerful. There was only two real channels, BBC and ITN, doing news, although the next year Channel 4 News came along. So it was a very different landscape. And now we have got such a plethora of news sources, but it's much more, you're very right, it's much more difficult to navigate. I do some talks in schools about fake news and how to spot it and how difficult it is. And what is difficult now is context, because there's a paper called The Sunday Sport, and when it started, it was just quite a joke. You had stories like World War II bomber found on moon. And you'd know it was a joke because you'd look at the newsstand, and there was the Sunday Sport with its stupid headline, and there was the Times or the Sun or whatever, and you could tell the context. Now, World War II bomber found on moon is, a trending topic on Twitter, and it takes quite a lot more work to understand what's going on. And it's funny because 10, 50, 20 years ago, media studies was a much derided subject in schools, and now it's become actually a rather important subject, I think.
Yeah, of course. And you haven't just written for the BBC, you've also written some of your own stuff as well, notably the book that you published last year. Do you think you could tell us a bit about the book for those people who haven't read it yet?
I was hoping you'd ask that. Yeah, because this is a real passion project, and it's complete. I wrote a book called Always On, which somebody turned up with tonight, which is, look at that, which was about my career as a tech journalist, really, about the smartphone era, and this is the opposite. So I said I was brought up by my mum, and she died in 1996 in a flat in South London, Ruskin Park House, a posh council estate, where she'd moved in the mid-50s, before I was born, with my half-brother. She'd left her husband in Bristol. She'd worked in the BBC during the war, loved the BBC so much that it ended up breaking up her marriage because her husband disapproved of it, thought she was getting heirs and ought to give it up. So she left him, came to London with her son, forged a career in working in television drama as a sort of director's secretary, director's assistant. Had an affair, which resulted in me. And when I went to clear her flat, where I'd grown up, which I really didn't like it, I was trapped in a one-bedroom flat with an increasingly batty old mum, I found that she'd kept every letter she'd received, and many of those that she'd written. She kept carbon copies as a very sort of skilled secretary, and it became a habit. She even wrote to her sisters, typed letters to her sisters. And it was the most extraordinary archive. And at the heart of it was a pink box which had contained stockings. And I opened the box, and inside was a brown envelope, and it had a message on it for Rory to read and think about, in the hope that it will help him to understand how it really was. And beneath that was a hotel bill for 2 nights bed and breakfast at the Three Crowns Inn in Angmering in West Sussex in April 1957, made out to a Mr. J. Cellan-Jones. I was born in January 1958. And beneath that were my father's love letters and lots of other letters telling the story of this extraordinary affair. And separately, there was a whole bunch of legal letters documenting what happened when she found she was pregnant by a man 16 years her junior, and it ended in a court battle, and it ended with me being brought up alone by her and meeting my father when I was an adult. I first wrote to my father when I was about to do my finals at Jesus, saying, isn't it a good idea that we should meet? So I couldn't write the book back then. You know, I read these letters and was kind of gobsmacked by them, put them away, didn't read them, you know, in great depth. I couldn't write the book while my father was still alive, but my father died in 2019, and after that I began to think about what a rich archive that was, and what a story it told of an incredibly brave woman who I'd thought was, frankly, a pain, like most people think of their parents. So that shaped the book.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I really think it's interesting throughout the book that you've kind of included little kind of extracts of these letters.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that you obviously found out all this information from these letters, which is obviously quite a tangible form of history and memories. But if we think about the way that future generations will look back at our lives today, they won't be able to go through letters and have these physical copies of our lives.
It'll be our WhatsApps, won't it?
Yeah, or our Instagram
if we've
pages.
Kept them, yeah.
So how do you feel about that?
Well, I think that it's really fascinating. I've had so many letters about the book, including from a woman who is a sort of historian of women at the BBC, saying what an extraordinary resource this is, and what a social history lesson it is. And it does make you sort of wonder what we will leave behind and the story we'll tell. I mean, there is this impression that these days we let it all hang out on social media. We're incredibly frank. But actually, we all know that social media is incredibly performative. We're playing a role. My mum's letters, particularly to her two sisters, are incredibly frank and intimate. I mean, her older sister, who's my aunt, who was lovely, and I spent a lot of time with my aunts. And when I knew her, she was chairman of the WI in her Bedfordshire village and a big figure in the Mid-Bedfordshire Conservative Association. But turns out she was on her third husband, and she writes, there's a whole incident where she writes to my mum, oh, I think I'm pregnant by this bloke, and he's gone off, and I'm going to the chemist to try and do something about it. You know, these extraordinary revelations that are embodied in that kind of letter. Yeah.
So speaking about social media, as many people will know, you obviously have your viral hashtag where you document your journey with your dog Sophie. So why did you decide to do this, and why on social media? Why on Instagram?
God, yeah. Sometimes I wonder. Well, I got into social media as part of my job. So in 2007, about 6 months after the Apple thing, I did a piece for the Today programme where I joined all the social networks that were around at that time. And it was a wonderful intro to it where John Humphreys read out the intro on the Today programme and called it Face Pack. I got the name wrong. It's an extraordinary idea. And I joined Facebook, was very enthusiastic about that for a while, and then by Christmas, the whole London tech community and tech reporters had moved to Twitter almost en masse and found it very useful. And I was a very enthusiastic early adopter and found it helped in my journalism a lot. I would, find stuff out. There was one occasion where there was an earthquake in China, and I woke up and it was people on Twitter were reporting this earthquake, and I rang the news desk, and they hadn't heard of the earthquake yet, so it can't possibly be true. It's not on the wires, but it was on Twitter, and people began to come. Other reporters began to come to me and say, "Can you help me, find stuff out on Twitter?" Robert Peston, notably, who in my leaving video says, "Well, thank you, Rory. You introduced me to Twitter, and you ruined my effing life." So I was very much a Twitterholic, and we'd had a lovely dog called Cabbage, who'd been a slight personality on Twitter, because every day during lockdown, I used to walk the dog, and it was obviously a really difficult time. I used to post a picture, very bland picture, because it was just the square of grass a few hundred yards from us. And people began to say they really liked it, and it's sort of part of the fabric of their day. Some expat in Hong Kong said it reminded him of home. And then there was a hugely dramatic incident where Cabbage was hijacked, the dog walker's van was hijacked and stolen, and it became a sort of social media sensation for the day, and the dog was found, and it was on the Radio 4 News the next morning. Cabbage is home. So Cabbage died, and we were very cut up about it, and my wife in particular said she couldn't be doing with getting a new dog for a while. And then we eventually did decide to get one. And we got this dog from Romania, who turned out to be absolutely terrified and hid behind the sofa. And it was just natural to say, we've got a new dog. And we posted this picture of this dog in my arms on the doorstep. And it just went boom. And then I started a hashtag, thinking, you need a hashtag. And it went on from there. And very soon, my wife was finding that no Cambridge committee meeting would start without her being asked about how's Sophie. And it's been a bit of a journey, as they say.
Yeah. So I think my last question before we move on to questions from the audience would be, what is the latest update with Sophie?
Well, Diane is away Monday to Wednesday, and the dog, rather annoyingly, because I'm the one with her all the time, prefers Diane and goes into a bit of a sulk. And so these last 2 days, she's not been eating much. She's been sitting in her bed eyeing me with a sort of, cynical look. But Diane's just got home and said she's eaten her food, she's a bit flighty, she's been in the garden, she's been out in the front garden, which is good, and she's climbed 3 steps. She's never been upstairs. So that's a bit of a breakthrough. And that's breaking news here, by the way.
Okay, so we'll have volunteers going around with microphones. So if you want to raise your hand if you have a question, Amy will point you out to the volunteers, and then you can ask Rory. Also to our live chat, I'll be monitoring the Q&A function. So put any questions in the chat, and then we'll try and answer them as well.
Thank you, that was enthralling. Just one question from me about your father and what his reaction was when you reached out to him.
Yeah, it was a very emotional time, because it was my finals, and my future was a bit uncertain. One of the things that made me decide to contact him was that I had been to various interviews. I was applying for jobs. I got to the final stage of a very grand BBC training scheme, and been interviewed by the editor of Nationwide and the former editor of Television News, who was a rather sort of acerbic chap. And he looked at my CV and said, because my father was really well known by then, he was a very leading BBC drama director. He directed the Forsyte saga in the 1960s. And this chap looked at me and said, looking at my CV, why no drama? Given your father, why have you not done any drama? And I, rather embarrassed, had to say, well, I've never met my father. And he and I were both mortally embarrassed. I didn't get the job. And I thought, this is mad. Why have I not met my dad? So I wrote him a letter and went to the pigeonholes day after day, and nothing came back, and got really mad, and wrote him a second letter, a rather intemperate letter, saying, what do you think you're doing here? And it turned out that the first letter had gone astray, and that both arrived at the same time. And he wrote me, a nice letter back, and we met in the summer. I had a temporary job while I was trying to get into journalism in a bank. And we met in my lunch hour, me dressed up in my one suit, and him in his sort of director's garb of open neck sandals, and we had the most embarrassing lunch ever. And we went on like that for several years, meeting occasionally for meals, and it was all fine. We never talked about anything substantial. And then my half-brother, because he had a whole family, who hadn't known about me until very late in the day. My half-brother, Simon, who's now himself a very distinguished TV director, found that he was working in the BBC as a trainee assistant floor manager, whereas I was a producer. And he rang me up, and we went to the wine bar at the bottom of Wood Lane and met each other, and I was welcomed into the family.
We've had a question from our online audience along the lines of family, from Tina Lawberg. How do you think your mother would have responded to your book?
That's interesting. Lots of people have asked me that. I think she'd have liked it. I think she'd have been... I mean, the funny thing for me is people have been saying what an extraordinary woman, what a heroine she was. And the slightly difficult thing is she was also a massive pain in the arse. As one's parent, she was very much trapped in the past. I always tell this story that the Christmas after she died, I was in the kitchen and I was having a bit of a tearful moment. And I said to my wife, gosh, she was always a pain at Christmas, wasn't she? Because she was. And my wife came and gave me a great big hug and said, love, she was a pain all the year round. But reading her, I mean, particularly the letters from the 40s and the 50s, I mean, the wartime in Bristol, the BBC was her university, really. She'd left school at 14, become a secretary, and she joined the BBC and worked in this extraordinary unit in Bristol, the talks department, which sounds dull, but it was all the great sort of writers and poets of the day during the war came through that place and did talks. And her boss was a man called Geoffrey Grigson, who was who went on to be my godfather, who was an extraordinary poet and critic, an explosive character. And what I couldn't get over reading the letters was how they talked on the same level, because I'd massively underestimated my mum, and how vibrant and exciting a character she was.
We got any more questions from?
One at the back there.
Yeah.
Hello. So seeing as like you've been on the tech scene for probably close to 20 years now, currently for me it looks like all phones are just the same with tiny little tweaks. Do you think in the next 10, maybe 15 years there will be any big jumps, or whether it will just continue small tweaks, small tweaks, small tweaks?
That's a good question. We used to get obviously incredibly excited by each... In the period 2007 to 2012, there was an extraordinary tidal wave of innovation, because the first iPhone was followed the following year by the first Android, and all sorts of innovations came in. Obviously, the cameras got much better. They got huge for a while, and then they shrank for a while. And then eventually we began to get a bit bored with them. And people began to ask me, well, what's next after the smartphone? And I used to say, well, more smartphone, because actually what's happening is not so much in the look and feel of it, but there's so many different areas of our lives are being transformed by them. So I write a lot at the moment about, I've got a Substack, which is the sort of latest form of a blog, about health and technology. I've got 2 long-term conditions, which make me particularly interested in that. And there's an awful lot that is happening with smartphones, overdue in the health area. For instance, I'm trying out a Parkinson's app, which is designed to make it easier to monitor people with Parkinson's remotely. And because it's incredibly analog, the way it's treated. You see a doctor once a year, probably. He makes you get out of your chair. He pulls your arm back and forth, makes you do that, and do these series of exercises to give you a score. And then changes your tablets, and then a year later it happens again. And this app is meant to sort of take that process online. And in the run-up to, when you first get the app, you have to do this set of exercises 4 times a day, involving the phone, using all the sensors on the phone, to hold it out like that, say R into it, do a whole bunch of things. It lasts 7 minutes, and I'm due one right now. I would do it right now, but I think it might be slightly, might interrupt slightly. So there's lots more happening in smartphones. The big question that has been the big question for about 5-10 years now is that going to be replaced, that smartphone experience, by a headset experience? So I was tremendously excited by something called Google Glass 10 years ago. And I managed to persuade an obscure part of the BBC to pay 1,500 quid for me to get a set. And I wore it for 3 months constantly and loved it. And it took photos and then eventually, at the end of the 3 months, I realized that what all my friends and all my relatives have been saying, and all my colleagues have been saying, was true, that I looked an idiot. And I stopped. And that the idiot problem is the big thing that we've got to get over with headset. The latest thing is the Apple headset, which unfortunately I don't think the BBC would have fallen for it this time if I'd said $3,000 or whatever. So there's in hardware terms, it's difficult, but there's a hell of a lot, as you know, going on beneath the surface in terms of AI and so on.
Leading on from this, Mary Becker has asked, what are your feelings about how AI will change the tech world and our lives in general?
Well, how many days have we got? So I credit myself with being part of the reason why we had this huge scare about AI. Because in 2014, I did an interview with Stephen Hawking, who'd had his technology upgraded. There was a tiny element of AI in that. It was basically predictive text that enabled him to communicate more rapidly. And the way you interviewed Stephen Hawking was you had to send him, say, half a dozen questions by email, and then 10 days later, he'd send you the replies. And then after that, you would go and record the interview. And my questions covered various sort of areas, but the last one was about AI. What did you think about it? And the answers came back, and they're all vaguely interesting. And I landed on the sixth one, and it said, basically, AI, if it becomes artificial general intelligence, will mean the end of the human race, will be obsolete. I thought, oh, that's a story. But then he fell ill, so we didn't actually record the interview. And there was sort of, well, this story might never happen. And then he got better, and then the day I interviewed him at the Savoy Hotel before a press conference, there was more trouble with his technology, and it wouldn't work. You always, by the way, slightly had this question in mind, is that really him? But his computer wasn't working, and then they turned it off and on again, and it worked. And he said this thing, and it went on the 10 o'clock news, and it went round the world as, you know, a big scare. So I think that kind of scare is massively overdone. There's a bit of a distraction from all the sort of nitty-gritty questions about bias and impacts on jobs and so on. And I think it's like lots of areas of technology. The effects will be, you know, not very visible in the short term, but huge in the long term. But as I say, it's something we could talk about for hours.
Yeah.
Yeah, second row.
Moving on from that line of discussion around the impact of technology and dealing with illness or dealing with disability, I'm obviously, as I think you know, Rory, I know a lot about living with someone with a very serious neurological illness, from which he died eventually, and that was. He died just over 10 years ago. But I am absolutely astonished by how developments that weren't possible then, I'm not just talking about tech, I'm talking about things like your amazing Movers and Shakers podcast, which I think it's so good to have been able to find a way of communicating not just to other people going through illnesses like Parkinson's disease, but also people living with them, their families, but also people who know nothing at all about it. I think it's a wonderful development which literally would not have been possible 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And incidentally, I know someone who's recently diagnosed with Parkinson's in the US, who's an old friend of mine, who I said, oh, you should look up this podcast, Movers and Shakers. He said, oh, I know about it already. So it's had a huge impact.
We're going global.
Huge impact, I know. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about, for those who might not know, how that came about, and also how you think that sort of approach could help people with other sorts of illnesses form these new types of communities.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, I think, first of all, what I'd like to say is there's an incredible contrast between, the fact that these digital conversations are now possible, these new ways of forming communities and reaching audiences are out there, and the actual impact of the technology on the treatment of the illness itself. Because the thing that really gets you go when you've got Parkinson's is the realization that the big breakthrough came 60 years ago with the discovery of levodopa. And we keep being told that the next big breakthrough is 5 years away. It's always 5 years away. But to get back to your question, it came about because a man called Edward Sturton, a very distinguished broadcaster who I was slightly in awe of. He was president of the union when I was here. And I used to go and listen to the union and think, gosh, these people are really clever. I could never speak in public like that. And I didn't really know him at all well. But I'd gone public with my Parkinson's about the year before. And he called me up and he said his oldest friend had just been diagnosed and was in a terrible way. Could I go for a drink with him? And I met this oldest friend, who turned out to be a High Court judge, Sir Nicholas Mostyn, who is the most bubbly person you've ever met, and didn't seem to be as badly affected as I thought. He's apparently was known as Tigger at the bar. And we met a couple of times at the pub, and the second time he said, do you mind if I bring Jeremy Paxman along? I went, right. I mean, I kind of walked past Jeremy in the corridor from time to time going, and he was going, but Jeremy turned up, and I assumed that they'd known each other for years. It turned out the judge, who's a man of extreme self-confidence, had just called Jeremy Paxman out of the blue. And we started meeting in Jeremy's local pub. And then a nice man called Paul Mayhew-Archer came along. He's a comedy script writer, Mark Mardell, broadcaster, Gillian Lacey-Solomon. And the judge began to say, we should write a book. It would be called Four Men in a Boat. This is when we were forming. And Jeremy quite rightly said, that's the worst idea anybody's had ever. But the judge is not to be defeated. And he starts talking about a podcast. And he bangs on about it so much that I get involved because I know a bit about that world, which he knows nothing about, but equally doesn't mind ringing up Gary Lineker's company and saying, can we do a podcast for you? And it just happened by sheer force of will. And it's bloody chaos. There's 6 of us and nobody's quite in charge. I've been on the WhatsApp today saying we're doing 3 days of recording, 6 episodes next week, and nobody's quite sure if anybody's booked the pub or not. So that's how it worked. But you're right, it's had the most extraordinary impact, and we've been incredibly encouraged by reading emails from people who say, you are talking about this and you're telling us stuff that our doctors have never told us.
We've had a question from Kevin Doyle asking, do you think you became better at spotting what were going to be significant technologies after your experience with iPhone?
No. I mean, it's one of those, the old cliched answer is like, financial journalists get asked about how good they are at spotting things. If I was good at spotting things, I would be, I'd be living on my desert island or whatever. And for every success, I'm proud of, with the iPhone. I was called onto the BBC's complaints programme because people have written in saying, why are you running a plug for a product? And I said, slightly taking my heart in my mouth, well, if the BBC had been around when the Model T Ford was launched, would that have been a product placement? And this phone could be influential, and of course it was amazingly influential. But I was also the guy that said when Google floated, oh, that's massively overpriced. And I told Mark Zuckerberg, the only time I've interviewed him face-to-face, which was 2008, you were mad to turn down $10 billion for Facebook, weren't you? So wrong. And I get very enthused by, I always try and remember the name of this company. There was a tiny little startup company which had a system for transferring data by sound. It wasn't called Twitch. No, it wasn't Spinvox. That's another story. That was a con. It was a very nice man from UCL. He started this. The idea was that your phone would send out a sort of a bird song. Was it called Twitch? Yeah, it could well have been called Twitch. And you would send a photo to your friend who'd have the app open, listening, and the audio signal would effectively transfer the data. And I was, because it worked in a demo, I was just transfixed by this. And the idea was that it might be used at gigs. You know, a band would say, everyone hold up their phone, and they'd get sent a song. Right. And of course, it crashed and died because nobody wanted noisy twitching going on all over the place. I was completely wrong about that. But when I saw the first Amazon Echo, got hold of that, that was again a technology which I was incredibly enthused by, and I think, you know, it may not be quite as big as I imagined, but it's in certain areas, particularly in assistive technology is a really interesting area. That's had a huge impact.
Any other questions in the room? Yep, top row.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. The BBC's obviously played a huge role in your life, and also I was very interested to learn in your mother's life and other family members as well. It's clearly an institution under pressure these days, partly from some of the technologies we've talked about a bit, and the rise of streaming and so on, and partly from political pressure and increasing interference from government. So, how confident are you in the future of the corporation?
The morale at the BBC is always the lowest it's ever been. So it's a good question. When I joined in the early 80s, it was a time of great tension between the BBC and the government. Norman Tebbit was really on the warpath about coverage of Libya and various other things. And if you'd asked me back then whether 40 years on the license fee would still be in place and the BBC would be much as it was, I would have been incredibly sceptical. So in some ways, I think it's been remarkably successful in hanging on to that model. And it's obviously getting ever more difficult. And this government it appears extraordinarily hostile to it. But the funny thing is, every time you say, for instance, oh, we're going to cut a regional politics programme, suddenly you get Tory MPs writing to the Director General saying what a disgrace this is, or maybe getting rid of the Parliament channel, which costs, you know, an inordinate amount per viewer. But so there is deep down still in the Shires quite a lot of support for it. But I think finding a new model is going to be a difficult path. There will need to be a new model, but nobody has convinced me that there is a better model than the license fee. It's like democracy, the worst idea ever, except for all the others.
We've had a question from Helen Haynes Dunmo, who asks, Rory, would you encourage young people to become journalists today? There's been a recent report that some journos and readers are getting PTSD from an excess of bad news.
Oh, golly. Well, obviously, if you want to do it, you should do it. Yeah, I mean, the idea that the news is more disturbing now than it was 40, 50 years ago, I think is slightly strange. There have always been bad things happening. There's a far wider range of coverage out there, and you don't have to be a war reporter. I remember actually when I was thinking of becoming a reporter, I went with a girlfriend to see a film called Salvador, and there are these journalists as heroes, and they're running across a battlefield, and one of them gets shot, and the other performs a tracheotomy on his colleague with his fountain pen. And my girlfriend at the time turned to me and said, "You sure you're up for this?" And I said, "I'm hoping I won't have to do that." But obviously, you've got to have the temperament for it, and you've got to accept that in a large number of cases you'll earn less than in a lot of other professions. But I've had a fantastic time doing it, so who am I to stop people?
Any other questions from the room? Yep, second row.
Thank you. Fantastic talk. When you were talking about Letraset at the beginning of your career and typewriters and how the world is now, do you think your interviewers looking back on their career will be reflecting on a similar sort of pace of change? Do you think that pace can really carry on?
It's always difficult to... I mean, I do think, the big change, obviously, in the media and in life generally is the move online and the impact computers have had, and it's difficult to see. Obviously, AI, we think will have a huge impact, but going from writing longhand to, texting or whatever, is such a huge. Sorry, I was going to bring out. I found while I was sort of searching through things, as I said, I had to write a letter to my mum each week because she didn't have a phone because she was cussed about it, and I acquired a typewriter in my final year because I wanted to be a journalist, and I found one of my early typed letters. "Dear Mother, as you can see, my typing is making very slow progress. This has not deterred," spelling I put, "me from typing letters to poor innocent victims who then spend hours deciphering them." So, the change from those days, it's difficult to see it being quite as radical in these people's lives, but who's to say?
We've had a question from Kevin Doyle asking, do you think that health tech will help the NHS survive within its limited resources, or will it just raise expectations and increase demand? Bit of a poison chalice for you there, Rory.
Well, no, I mean, it is an interesting question. I mean, I'm involved in, for instance, I'm involved in a patient committee about a new way of treating Parkinson's, which has been pioneered in the southwest of England. It's called home-based care. And it's trying to deal with the fact that this pattern of seeing your consultant once a year, they had a terrible time in parts of southwest England where people were waiting 2 years between appointments. By having a more sort of graded system where people communicated from home, didn't necessarily have to go into the hospital, could speak to different people, and would be sent a smart watch to wear for every 6 months as a sort of backstop, just to check on them, that they weren't sort of ignoring their needs for care, and that, in theory, I mean, the National Health Service is trying desperately to stop people coming to hospital so much because that's incredibly expensive and very time-consuming, and for both the patients and the doctors to have that rigid appointment system. And if you could develop tech like the app I'm using, like smartwatches, that would make that happen, that would have a payoff in theory, but in the long term. And the really difficult thing for this technology revolution in the health service is getting the funding in the short term. It's expensive in the short term, and the theories that pay off in the long term. And that I do worry about. I ran a seminar for health tech companies, and it was all off the record. And one of the biggest health tech companies in the UK, new company in the UK, said it was now abandoning the UK market mostly and just operating in the US, because it said the NHS is really keen on trying out our stuff and piloting our stuff, but actually they don't want to pay for it. So there's only a certain amount of trials and pilots and freebies that we can give them. At some stage, we need to earn some money.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. So, yeah, at the front.
Well, can we get you on the mic? Is that all good?
By writing, thank you for your talk. It was fantastic. By writing your book, what is the main message you would like to give your readers?
Oh, golly. I'm not entirely sure that this book is intended to have a message. It's an emotional journey that I'm taking people on, and it turns out, given the letters I've had, particularly from people of a certain age, while I was writing it, I was listening to the radio one day, and it said we've just gone past more than 50% of children being born out of wedlock, to use an incredibly old-fashioned term, which is on my Wikipedia page. Somebody's written, I was born out of wedlock, which is rather amusing. And it's difficult to understand how in the late 50s and early 60s, the shame, particularly for a middle-class woman, there was of having an illegitimate child. And I would hope that it would kind of illuminate that for people. I mean, it particularly speaks to that sort of demographic. And lots of people have written to me with similar experiences. And, you know, for instance, there are lots of letters around about my birth from friends and relatives of my mum saying, you should have him adopted, which she was, you know, brave enough not to do. So I don't think there's a particular message. I just want people to come on that sort of emotional journey with me, I suppose. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, I think that's the end of everything today. We want to say thank you very much to you guys for coming out, and thank you very much for Rory for making the trek up here from London. It's been lovely. You've spoken wonderfully. It's been really interesting. Thank you very much.
Well, you guys have done a great job. Thank you.